Hi everyone, I'm William Lee, and you're watching the latest weekly installment of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia, my YouTube series where we are moving toward looking at what role the Russian Grand Dukes played and what the relationship was between the state and the dynasty in pre-revolutionary Russia. So clearly I'm not coming to you by candlelight this time, and one of the reasons being, here's what my candle looks like at the moment. Yeah, so anyway, I got a little bit of an earlier start today, and it's a nice late afternoon. What are we talking about today? Well, one thing that's really important is to bear in mind Peter the Great's role as a role model for what a Russian leader should be and for what a male member of the imperial family should be, and to a certain extent even what a female member of the imperial family should be if in fact she was playing an important role or was herself an empress or a ruler. So yeah, we want to keep that in mind very much throughout the entire series. So we are going to continue today and actually finish up with Peter the Great's reign. Last time we talked about his table of ranks and his introduction of the more Western military ethos, the ethos of a professional military where one's identity is tied to the greatness of the state and to one's status as a professional officer, and also likewise in the civil service, which also had its table of ranks. So the question today, as we finish up with Peter the Great's reign, is a very interesting and open-ended one. So it has to do with Russia's mission. So what was Russia's mission before, as the leaders perceived it and as the other strata of society perceived it? What was Russia's mission before Peter, before the empire? What was Russia's mission as Peter perceived it and as he was trying to bring other people to see it? And what was Russia's mission thereafter? What is it today? You know, I can only go so far with talking about that. We don't have hours and hours and hours. But it's an interesting question for all of us to ask ourselves, I suppose. I come from a country that also has a real sense of mission, or at least has in the past. So I'm American, and the Americans have always considered themselves exceptional, and the American mission has always been this grand idea of spreading democracy to the world. And that, I think, is an admirable idea as it is, but you know, in order to do that, you have to sort of exemplify the principles that you're trying to spread to other people. So that can be, of course, very problematic. But whatever country you're from, it's always interesting to ask that question. And if you were to go interview some members of your country's military and say, you know, what is the greatest good as a soldier sees it, or as, you know, as a citizen sees it for the country, and what would you say the country's mission is, if any, it would be very interesting to see what they would say. I guess I haven't tried that myself. Maybe I will. But I've been reading a book a very interesting book that was published in 2013 by a Russian author named Viktor Kosik, and it's a book about the Young Russia Party, which was an emigre, post-revolutionary emigre political party that was mainly in France. It was headquartered in France at any rate. And the author, Kosik, is talking about how, in choosing to write this book, he wants to see how the post-revolutionary Russian emigres, the first and second generations, how they saw Russia's mission, looking at it from abroad and still seeing themselves as actors in forming Russia's future. Okay, so very interesting book. I've just finished the introduction, so I'm not very far along with it yet. Okay, so going back then, the prelude to Peter the Great, what was the Muscovite Russian mission? Well, I would say, of course, this is generalizing, but I would say that it was this idea of Russia being the third Rome. So the first Rome had been Rome. The second Rome had been Byzantium, Constantinople. The third Rome would be Moscow, and the saying went something like, and a fourth Rome there will never be. So it was essentially religious, very grand, of course, but essentially religious. And so the Muscovite state saw itself as the new Byzantium, but not really in an imperial sense, not really in the sense of empire. Muscovy, was pretty insular, and that was fine with the people. The rulers, the Romanov rulers, even though they were more in the model of the meek and pious Tsar. And that was the Romanov mythos at that time. They still, had some idea of wanting to play a grander role in the world. Actually, I have an icon here. This is interesting, that a friend in Switzerland gave me. So this is the last emperor and empress of Russia, Nicholas and Alexandra, and their 5 children. And you can see that I'm not sure what you would call the clothes that the daughters are wearing, but the emperor, his wife, and the heir to the throne, Alexei, are all wearing Muscovite-style clothing. And the Muscovite-style clothing, particularly with Nicholas II, goes back to Byzantium. And in fact, if you go to an Orthodox church now, you will see priests and bishops wearing robes like this. And you will see double-headed eagles used as decorative motifs. For instance, in my Greek Orthodox church, the double-headed eagles can be found on the chandeliers. And the double-headed eagle, of course, representing when Rome split into an eastern and western part. One empire, supposedly, but there was the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, and so you had 2 Caesars, and you had two eagles, one looking to the east and one looking to the west, but still Rome. And so then with the diaspora, the Christian diaspora, after Byzantium was ended, after Constantinople was sacked by Crusaders, actually, not initially by Muslims, but by Crusaders. The diaspora kept some of the imperial symbols, and they ended up, interestingly, being incorporated into the vestments within the church. So an Orthodox bishop is basically dressed like a Byzantine emperor. And so this icon, this post-revolutionary icon, definitely is giving us the symbols of Muscovy, the meek and pious Tsar, who is indeed a martyr, and the connection to Byzantium. So that was the Muscovite view of the world. The new Rome, that was the mission. That was it exactly. So what was Peter's mission? What was the mission of Petrine Russia? Well, empire. Peter set his sights on turning Russia into not just Muscovy or Rus, but into Rossiya, the Russian Empire. And he had in mind that it would not be just an empire in the sense of going in and taking over other smaller states and incorporating them into the empire and spreading out, but also in the sense of being a great power. A great power, nobody could sneer at Russia anymore, as the European great powers always had. That Russians were barbaric, that they were backwards, that everything they tried was quixotic, and, you could laugh at them. And that's always been, unfortunately, a part of the Russian consciousness. And so that makes it even more of a goal to make Russia a great power, and then to maintain that great power and not to be a laughingstock, not to be laughed at or sneered at by anyone. So even to this day, I remember that I had a Russian friend in London way back in the 90s, and he said to me once, William, Russians are the racial slur of Europe, and I'm not going to speak the racial slur that he used, but it's probably the worst one you can use in the United States. And he was expressing a genuine feeling that was how the rest of Europe looked at Russians. And so certainly this is not a political program, and I'm not going to discuss modern politics, but these are things throughout Russian history that we should keep in mind. So there's that chip on the shoulder and that desire to put yourself in such a powerful position that nobody dares laugh at you. Okay, so what do you need for an empire? For an empire, you need a great military, and for a great military, you need dedicated professional soldiers, officers, sailors, naval officers, and you need a great economy. And to achieve those things, you need to make the most efficient use of your human resources, and Russia had vast human resources, and you need to bend them toward that goal of empire. So that's what Peter set about doing. And that was the topic in the previous video, last week's video, and if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to watch, because it will go into more detail about that. So returning to the question of mission and looking ahead a little. So I've said in the past several times that Peter was creating this very dangerous fault line beneath the surface of the Russian psyche and Russian culture and consciousness, because he left the vast majority of the population, i.e. the peasants, he was happy to leave them untouched, to leave them in a primitive state, so that they could on the basis of giving them to the nobility and the educated classes as serfs, that would gain their willingness to switch to this imperial mindset and to become willing servitors with who have bought into this new Russian mission and made it an important part of their own identity. So the peasants were left completely unmodernized in this sort of state of primitive communism, you could say, because they farmed communally and saw themselves in communal terms. So that created this huge fault line. That, and the fact that you still had this counter narrative of Russia being a holy land where there is a mystical spiritual connection between the Tsar and the people, and where the West represents corruption and the demonic and that sort of thing. So the peasants have become the bearers of those traditions and of that traditional mindset, while the nobility and educated people and the ruler are looking west and wanting to be this Western great power. So yeah, as great as he was at reforming things, Peter really dropped the ball on that one. So then this fault line, things start to rumble. In the 19th century, you have a movement that is to sort of glory in Russian culture and Slavic culture as a whole. And so you had these two groups within educated society within what you could call civil society, though that didn't really exist in Russia per se, but it was starting to exist. So you had these two opposing groups, the Westerners or Westernizers, they're sometimes called, and the Slavophiles. And the Westernizers themselves said Russia does not have culture. Russia does not have an indigenous culture. All Russia has is this embarrassing primitive mishmash, and everything that we have, every innovation that we have, are the roots of our elite culture. Everything comes from the West, and that's as it should be. We are a Western European great power, and that's not embarrassing for us. That's as it should be. And we want to keep modernizing and going forward like all the other Western European empires. The Slavophiles, although I won't say that they no longer wanted Russia to be an empire, they still preferred that model of the Third Rome and Holy Mother Rus and Muscovy, and they said not only did Russia and the Slav world have its own culture, its own indigenous culture, but it was one worth celebrating. It was a brilliant one, and in fact, it was better than the Western ones, even though it had been left in this sort of primitive state. That had actually preserved it, and that had protected it from corruption. So again, this is a theme that you're going to find throughout Russian history, but it really came to a head in the mid-19th century and the period of great reforms, and many members of the imperial family embraced that Slavophile mentality. Alexander II did not, but his son Sergei did, and it made Grand Duke Constantine Nikolaevich, who was a brilliant man, as Peter had been, and a great reformer, as Peter had been, it made him a pariah in the family. Once Alexander II died, he was assassinated in 1881, and his son, Alexander III, came to the throne. He still wanted an empire. Nicholas II still wanted an empire, but they were definitely Slavophiles. And they didn't appreciate the model set by Grand Duke Constantine Nikolaevich, who was more or less banished to the Caucasus. Okay, so Dostoevsky then and Russian literature came and tried to reformulate the Russian mission. So Dostoevsky famously said that beauty will save the world, and he also said that Russia will save the world. So his idea was a mission of beauty. So the way that Russia was beautiful was in so far as it could be to the world a Christ bearer. So if it was a Christ bearer, then it could save the world. And of course, to be a Christ bearer is to be beautiful. So Dostoevsky was very much a Russian chauvinist, in a geopolitical sense, but his idea of Russia's mission to the world, very sincerely expressed, was, it was quite a beautiful one, to bring the world into harmony, not have Russia go out and conquer the world, but to bring the world into this vision of the Christian ideal of peace and beauty, and yeah, to be a Christ bearer. All right, so that is all very, very important thematically. Now we can go back to look a little bit more at the way that Peter was changing things. So as I said, we talked about the table of ranks, and given that Peter himself had worked his way up in the table of ranks, starting out as a boy. He wasn't playing with toy soldiers like these. He was playing with actual other boys. And as they grew, these regiments grew with them and became actual regiments. And Peter started out as a drummer boy and mastered the tasks required at each level of service. He really did. And so he set the model for all male Romanos to come, that they also were bound to the title of ranks and bound to the service role. So that will be very significant later with the Grand Dukes. And as long as this attitude was strong within the royal family, which now became the imperial family, then it could work in a good, cohesive, constructive way with the Russian state and dynasty would not be rival institutions. All right, now a Grand Duke could not have decided to, say, pursue some other kind of career and bow out of the service role. That was absolutely not acceptable from then on. So the minute you stepped out of the service role was the minute that you were no longer a Grand Duke for all intents and purposes. I mean, you could retire like any other professional military man could retire, but you had to have that military career to look back on, and that civil career, that service career to look back on. Some of the Grand Dukes added to their military career also political things, like Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich would be the Governor General of Moscow, Grand Duke Mikhail Nikolaevich would be the Viceroy of the Caucasus, so on and so forth. Okay, but it was not an option for a Grand Duke as a Grand Duke to not have a service role. And I think that was mainly the case in other European dynasties, but not quite as vitally so, I would say. Okay, so when it came to an heir to the throne, well, Peter understood that you could not have an heir to the throne, even outside of, even if he had, been disinherited, you could not have an heir to the throne that didn't fit into that service model. That would be a real danger to this link between state and dynasty. And so he allowed his own son, Alexis, who wanted to return to Muscovy, he allowed his own son and heir to be killed, or his presumptive heir, I should say, because Peter changed the law so that the ruler could choose his own heir. It didn't have to be his eldest son. It didn't even have to be a member of the Romanov family. Okay, so in later times, Grand Dukes who went astray of the rules would be banished from Russia. They would still have the title of Grand Duke, but they would lose the income and the privileges and the trappings. They would lose all the practical effects of being a Grand Duke, and they would not be allowed to return to Russia, where again they would be a disruptive element, even if they just sort of sat quietly at home. So they could not return to Russia until the Tsar decided that he would restore them and they could step back into their service role. All right, so these instances were almost all at times when Grand Dukes married against the will of the Tsar, but that comes much later. Okay, so what about the other organs and institutions? Well, the church was now an organ of state. The patriarch of the church could have represented himself as an alternate focus to the Tsar. The Tsar still claimed to have his divine prerogative, but a bishop, the patriarch, could conceivably have set himself up as being another center of that. So Peter quickly got rid of the patriarch and set up the Holy Synod, in which you had a non-church member, a lay member at the head, and that would never be restored by any of the emperors of Russia or empresses. In fact, the irony is that it would only be restored by the Bolsheviks and by the Soviets. And then after the revolution, you had a patriarch again. So that's sort of one of the ironies of history. Okay, so the military as an organ of state, as a body that was devoted to this mission of the state to be a great geopolitical power. Well, that was what Peter wanted, but it was also setting up an institution that could potentially be dangerous to the dynasty, because if there was a break between the state and the dynasty, then the military belonged to the state. The military had its mission, as I said, to preserve Russia's power as a geopolitical great power, its status as a geopolitical great power, and that identity was at Peter's desire, and that ethos was being very strongly inculcated into the professional officer class. So here is another source of danger beneath the surface. Okay, so to finish up with Peter's reign, we'll talk a little bit about some more personal things that are also, though, symbolic of what was going on. So none of Peter's Romanov predecessors had specifically named an heir. So they had this practice of, when their eldest son turned 13, of bringing him out into public and having him side by side with the Tsar, and in that way sort of communicating that he was that he was the heir to the throne, but not, there was no succession law, and there was no sort of official declaration. So yeah, so what did Peter do? He changed the law so that he could choose anyone, ideally an eldest son, but failing that, he could choose anyone who would step into his footsteps as the protector of the state and Russia's great power status. So you would think then that marriage would be a very important part of that, because the royal families of the European great powers, for the most part, intermarried. So yeah, the non-Catholics tended not to marry with the Catholic dynasties, but still, you would marry a princess from some other country with a powerful dynasty. And indeed, as far back as the first Romanov Tsar, Mikhail, he had tried to marry his daughter to a prince of Denmark, and that hadn't worked out for various reasons. Maybe it was one of these cases where there was, where Russia was sneered at. But anyway, that hadn't worked out. And the other heirs to the throne and rulers had married women from the boyar class, and the Romanovs had started out as a boyar family. Peter's mother, who belonged to the boyar clan of the Narishkins, had chosen a wife for him who was also a boyarinya, a noble woman. And Peter was trying as hard as he could to break these clans apart and to slot them into his modern service class. So it's not surprising that it didn't work out, this marriage that his mother had arranged for him. and this young woman who was very much a Muscovite in worldview, and so they were at odds from the beginning. And he ended up divorcing her and sending her to a convent, which basically neutralized her. Once you entered a monastery or a convent, you could not return to the secular world. But the son that he had by her was loyal to his mother. Alexei was loyal to his mother and also had the Muscovite point of view. So as we know, Peter got him out of the way. He got both of them out of the way. But then he married a low-born woman. So there's not it's hard to find out the precise information about her. She seems to have had sort of mixed ethnic background, Lithuanian, Latvian, maybe some German, maybe some Russian, and she had been a servant. She was a woman of humble birth. She was taken up by Peter's best friend, Menshikov, a companion of his childhood in these so-called play regiments, and Menshikov had also been a man of low birth, but she was taken in by Menshikov, I think maybe either as a mistress or as someone that he would put in Peter's path to please Peter and gain his favor, and that indeed did end up happening, and Peter just didn't hesitate to marry her, even though she was a low-born woman, and if he was going to be true to his own ideals of the powerful European great power, he should not have done that, but Peter was Peter, and he did it. And then, as with previous as with previous tsars before him, here's another lapse. The last thing you would expect Peter to have done was that he did not name a successor. He promulgated this law in 1722, saying that the emperor could choose, or the Tsar, the ruler, could choose his successor, and then he himself did not choose one. So when Catherine, his wife, she'd been born with the name Marta. When she became the Tsaritsa and then the Empress of Russia, she took the name Catherine. And when she died, there was her, and there was a child, a boy of about 10 or 11, I think, who was Peter the Great's grandson through his son Alexei. And Peter had loathed his son Alexei so much that he showed no interest in his grandson, and didn't want to see him, didn't want to know about him. And he went on and had 12 new children with Marta, with his wife, but only 2 of them survived, 2 out of 12. Wow. So, and they were both daughters. So the logical heir to the throne then, if this tradition of primogeniture had remained in place, would have been Peter Alexeyevich, the grandson. But in actuality, whether Peter would have preferred it or not, and I think he probably would have, the next ruler of Russia became Russia's first empress, Catherine. So she became Catherine the First. Catherine the Great would be Catherine the Second. Meanwhile, she was Catherine the First. And there was going to be a council, as with the previous Romanovs, who had all left the succession crises. There was going to be a council, and the council was going to decide, and the council was probably going to choose little Peter Alexeyevich, but the Menshikov and these newly powerful members of Peter's service class, the so-called new men, many of whom were officers in guards regiments, they got together and they ensured that it was not grandson Peter, but wife Catherine who became the new ruler of Russia. So I can tell you it did not last very long, because she had tuberculosis and she died only 2 years after her husband had died, and she did designate a successor, and her successor was Peter the grandson. So we will get into that next time when we're talking about the post-Petrine 18th century in Russia. But what we have now is the first indications that, yes, we have now a very powerful service class. And be careful what you wish for, Peter. So these new men have ensured that that Peter's wife and not his grandson become the ruler. And what does that bode for the future? Well, we are going to see. We are going to see. So come back next week, and we will be moving forward into the 18th century after Peter the Great. Bye.